Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hey, I'm Dave Dufour.
I'm S.
And I'm Zena.
We're the hosts of the NBA Daily, a new podcast from The Athletic.
It's a quick 20-minute recap of the most important games and stories from around the league.
It's everything you need to know about the NBA in the time it takes you to eat your breakfast.
Check it out every day, Monday through Saturday on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Athletic.
Hello, and thanks for joining me, Richard Williams, and my friend Matt Bishop for another episode of And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. How's it going, Matt?
Very good, thank you. And I'm actually quite interested to get stuck into our first episode of the season that's not about Formula One. Although there are some pretty significant F1 connections, aren't there?
There are. On this episode, we're winding the clock back to 1995, when McLaren, out of nowhere really, won the Le Mans 24 Hours at their first attempt, and in a car that wasn't even designed with racing in mind.
Indeed, yes. It's an incredible story, actually, not least because... A bit of a stat early on, because only one manufacturer has ever won at Le Mans on its first attempt before, or ever had before McLaren, and that was Ferrari, all the way back, I believe, in 1949.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope between us we'll do a decent job of telling this tale, because, as listeners will probably or may probably already know by now, I used to work at McLaren, albeit from 2008 to 2015, so not at the time of their Le Mans victory. And your credentials are far more impressive still, because the last book you wrote, I believe, was all about Le Mans, wasn't it, Richard? And I'm going to give it a plug now. It's called 24 Hours, 100 Years of Le Mans. It's published by Simon & Schuster, and it's available at all good booksellers, probably a few bad booksellers as well, and a damn fine book it is too.
Well, thank you, Matt. That's very, very kind of you. And as you can tell from the title of the book, it really dives into the history of the 24 hours. And actually, a backwards look from 1995 is probably a good place for us to start, because although McLaren, the team, had never won or even entered Le Mans before 1995, the race was very much ingrained in its DNA, not least through its founder. Bruce McLaren, you'll remember, was only 21 when he came to Europe from New Zealand to race in F1 for Cooper alongside Jack Brabham. And winning the United States Grand Prix at Sebring that year made him the youngest ever Grand Prix winner, a record that stood for more than 40 years, until Fernando Alonso took it. He founded Bruce McLaren Motor Racing in 1963, but he also competed at Le Mans 8 times, and he won the race in 1966 in a Ford GT40 alongside Chris Amon, his fellow Kiwi. You remember that? That's the race immortalised in the Ford versus Ferrari movie, or called Le Mans 66, depending on where in the world you're watching it. And that was the race where the Ken Miles Denny Hulme GT40 crossed the line first, but was deemed to have completed less distance because of the old Le Mans-style start.
Nice little anorak fact there, Richard.
You can have that one, Matt. But anyway, alongside being a race-winning F1 driver and constructor, Bruce was an accomplished sports car racer, and McLaren produced some beautifully brutal and hugely successful sports cars for the US and Canada-based Can-Am sports car series, which was enormously popular in the late 60s and early 70s, with big crowds and very big purses.
Yeah, absolutely. Can-Am is one of those series, in the 60s and 70s that I'd love to have attended some of those races, but obviously I didn't, because I wasn't in Canada or America, and I was only a child. But anyway, I remember several of those cars, those great cars, being on display on the boulevard, the so-called boulevard, in the McLaren Technology Centre when I used to work there. And anyone who has ever seen a McLaren M6A or M8A or B or C or D in action, which I didn't at the time, as I say, but at an event like the Goodwood Revival or the Goodwood Festival of Speed, will know how incredibly impressive and, as you say, brutally loud those flame-spitting cars were and are.
It's interesting if you go to Goodwood and see a field of those Can-Am cars, many of them McLarens. It's wonderful to see how people still cherish them and the enormous enjoyment they get out of driving them. Those are terrific brutes, aren't they?
Absolutely. And the spectators love watching them and listening to them, as you say. But also modern drivers, young drivers, they think this is a privilege.
Yeah.
I mean, Porsche 917, 917, call it what you will. Obviously a great Le Mans car. We're getting off the subject. I'll jump back to the subject in a minute. But the Mark Donoghue Can-Am version was the most brutal version of all, was it not? Mm-hmm. Enormous power. Well over 1,000. Yep. Anyway, horsepower. I think the M8D is my favourite of those cars, although tragically it was the model in which Bruce had his fatal accident at Goodwood on June the 2nd, 1970. And the reason I mention the date is that 40 years later, on June the 2nd, 2010, by which time, as I say, I was McLaren's comms and PR chief, we decided to mark the 40-year anniversary of our founder's sad death, not with a minute's silence, but with a minute's noise. It was actually my colleague Steve Cooper's idea. Great guy, Steve. Anyway, so we wheeled out the M8D. Danny Holmes, of course, because Bruce's had been destroyed at Goodwood in the accident that killed him. We wheeled Denny's car out of the factory and onto the paved area just outside the main entrance. And Tyler Alexander and Neil Trundle, McLaren stalwarts, both, of course, fired up that magnificent old 8-litre Chevy V8. It was a wonderful racket. One of the greatest sounding engines I've ever heard, actually. Not a high-pitched scream like a 1970s Matra V12, which, Richard, you'll remember well.
Oh, I certainly do. My favourite, actually. My favourite sounding racing engine.
And one of mine.
Yeah.
One of mine. But that was a high-pitched scream. Wonderful. And also another high-pitched scream, not like any recent or relatively recent Formula One V10 either, but low, guttural, throaty, violent, fierce, and above all, very, very loud. Actually, you can find the video of that minute's noise on McLaren's YouTube channel still now, and I recommend you seek it out. And there are two little details I'd like to draw your attention to, whether you do watch it or not. When Neil Trundle cuts the engine and everything is suddenly totally silent, there's an unplanned and spontaneous round of applause from all of us who were either part of the team that had organised it, as I was, or other people who had taken a break from their work to go along and witness the great event, because it was a great event, as plenty had actually, and you'll see on the video there's a crowd of people there. And as the applause is going on, Tyler Alexander runs a hand lovingly. There's only one appropriate word, yes, and it is lovingly, along the car's big, fat rear wing. I love that. Also, most of us were in shirt sleeves because it was a warm June day. But Ron Dennis appeared without warning or arrangement just before the car was due to be fired up, wearing his usual immaculate grey suit, shirt, and tie pulled up tight. Others put their fingers in their ears, but Ron, the old racer, stood to attention close to the car, his hands behind his back, and never flinched. Afterwards, Neil Trundle said to me, "There's probably only 3 people in this whole factory who'd know how to strip that car down, clean and prep all the bits, then rebuild it ready to race. Me, Tyler, and Ron." I love that too.
That's a brilliant story. And doesn't it say a lot about a side of Ron that, for reasons that are mysterious to the likes of you and me, he preferred to keep absolutely hidden away?
Absolutely, and he shouldn't do, because he should be proud of that.
Yep, I would be.
To be the multi-millionaire entrepreneurial motor racing mogul that he is, but also know how to strip down and rebuild an M8D, pretty tasty.
Yep, indeed. So anyway, the McLarens were completely dominant in Can-Am for 5 years, winning the title from 1967 to 71. This was a company with serious sports car DNA, even if it wasn't making production sports cars for the road like its F1 rivals Ferrari and Lotus were doing. But had Bruce not been killed, perhaps he'd have started a project to take the team to Le Mans with their own car. Perhaps he would, yeah. But if I may, before we go on to discuss that, since I'm on a bit of a roll, I'm going to tell you another Bruce-related story, if I may. Oh, by all means. Okay. That's what you're here for. It's going to take a little while, this one, but bear with me, because I think it's a good story. When Bruce died, Tyler was in Indianapolis, because the Indy 500 had just taken place 3 days before. And in that great race, all Indy 500s are great races, McLaren had run two Offenhauser, we prefer the word Offenhauser-engined M15 McLarens for Peter Revson and Carl Williams. Not many people remember Carl Williams anymore. No, I was going to say who. he did exist, and he did race that car, but he wasn't as famous as then or, of course, now as Revy. Anyway, one day before he had his stroke, Tyler I'm talking about, because very sadly Tyler did later die of a stroke, and I'll come to that. But anyway, before he had his stroke, I asked Tyler, we were sitting in my office in the McLaren Technology Centre, and I asked Tyler to tell me about that time, the time of Bruce's death. As I say, we were in my office, and we had a coffee each, despite Ron's no food and drink in the offices rule. Actually, sometimes he said no comestibles, except he often said no combustibles. Anyway, we did have comestibles, but hopefully no combustibles in my office that day. Anyway, Tyler was in talkative mood, which wasn't always the case, but today he warmed to his theme. And I didn't exactly keep a diary in those days, but I had lots of notebooks and I wrote a lot in them. And reading what I wrote in my notebook that day, this is what he told me, Tyler. I was having breakfast at a hotel in Indianapolis. Denny had had a testing shunt at Indy before the big race, and his hands had been painfully burned. So I was already a bit concerned about that. As I was sitting there having my breakfast, there was a tannoy message. Phone call for Mr. Tyler Alexander. So I got up, walked to the reception desk and took the call. It was Teddy. He meant Teddy Mayer, Bruce McLaren's number 2 at the time. Teddy told me that Bruce had bought the farm at Goodwood that day. As you know, Richard, bought the farm was a common euphemism among racing folk back then. For the unhappiest of events. For the most unhappy, as you say, unhappiest of events. So this is Tyler again. I flew straight to England. I phoned up a few of the boys when I got there, and I asked them what they were going to do. Some of them said they might try to get a job at Brabham's or Cooper's. Always pluralised, by the way. Do you remember in the lexicon of old racing men back then, as indeed was McLaren's, actually? Do you remember that? Yeah, I'd have said it was an apostrophe S, actually. Brabham's or Cooper's. It might be. Yeah. So you'd write it with an apostrophe, would you? Okay, fine. Well, nobody can hear the difference. The grammar queen. No one can hear the difference, but whether we're using an apostrophe or not, because we're talking, not writing. But anyway, it was always called Brabham's, Cooper's, McLaren's, etc. Anyway, back to Tyler. Others wondered whether their wives would let them move to Norfolk if Colin Chapman needed anyone at Lotus. Nobody ever said Lotuses, I don't think. Back to Tyler. We all kind of assumed the dream was over. After all, Bruce was McLaren. He wasn't only our boss. He was our leader, our mentor, our friend. Now that Bruce had gone, we all kind of assumed that McLaren was gone too. Anyway, despite that, I decided to go into the workshop.
when I got there, I found that others had had the same idea. "What are you doing here?" I asked them. "I don't know. It just seemed the right place to be," they said. Soon Gordon, he means Gordon Cuppuck, the chief designer, began saying to people, "Okay, look, I can see that everyone is upset. So if you want to go home and spend a bit of time with your wives and families, feel free to do so." Then Teddy stood up on a chair, asked for silence, and said, "Yes, Gordon is right. We're all upset. We've lost a boss. We've lost a leader. We've lost a mentor. We've lost a friend. We've lost a driver. We've even lost a car. But in a week's time, we're due to fly to Canada for a Can-Am race at Mosport. I say we give it our best shot for Bruce. I say we work like crazy to get the car ready, and I'll try to find us a driver. Let's go for it." That's what Tyler said to me. And then he leaned forward in my office, took a sip of cappuccino, and said, "And we did. And we won." My God, I love that. I've written about it before, actually, in my regular motorsport column, but it bears repeating. Those few men, distressed and dispirited as they were, knuckled down to work day and night to build a new M8D. Teddy Mayer hired Dan Gurney, the great Dan Gurney, to drive it. Exhausted, they all flew to Canada, and they arrived at Mosport, which, by the way, even then was regarded as a scarily dangerous place. Gurney took the pole. The next day, he won the race. Those 6 words, "and we did, and we won," Tyler's 6 words, have always been an inspiration to me. Honestly, they have, in my time at McLaren and in a small way ever since. They express the esprit de corps and grim determination that characterise the way things sometimes have to be done in the sport that I love, that you love, Richard, that our listeners love, that we all love.
It would be easy to imagine that event tearing the heart out of the company completely, wouldn't it? And just everybody, as you described, that some of them were thinking, down to, where are we going to do what we do next?
Exactly.
Just amazing it didn't
They
happen.
thought it was all over. Anyway, Gurney won next time out too at Mont Tremblant. Hulme continued to race in honour of Bruce, with his burned and injured hands, remember, even though his doctors had advised him not to, and even though every time he took off his gloves, he peeled off a fresh layer of skin, painfully delaying his recovery. He won 6 Can-Am races that year and became Can-Am champion. His father, you know this, I'm sure, his father had won a Victoria Cross in World War II. The apple didn't fall far from the tree, did it, Richard?
No, that's an amazing story. Just extraordinary.
Anyway.
He was a tough old boy, wasn't he?
He was. And of course, he died at the wheel of a BMW M3 at 140 miles an hour when he had a heart attack.
Yeah.
Just about managed to bring the car to a stop and then passed away in the car. Anyway, great guy, Danny Hulme, another podcast. That was a bit of a diversion, but I hope you'll forgive it, and I hope our listeners will forgive it. After Bruce's death, McLaren continued to race in Can-Am for a while, and they'd also race in IndyCar and, of course, Formula One. But as the years went on and Ron took the helm in the 1980s, they became exclusively an F1 team. And that's what they were in 1987, when Gordon Murray, ace designer and chief architect of McLaren's Le Mans win, if you like, joined the team. Now, Gordon isn't someone I know at all well. I confess that. I don't. We didn't overlap at Brabham. I've met him, talked to him, but I don't know him at all well. But he's always been a bit of a superstar in my eyes because his Brabham BT44 and BT44B, as raced in the mid-70s, 2 Grand Prix victories at 4 wonderful circuits by, I need to shoehorn Carlos Reutemann into every podcast, don't I, my childhood hero. And he won in those cars at Kyalami, brilliant circuit, at Österreichring, brilliant circuit, at Watkins Glen, brilliant circuit, and, of course, at the old Nürburgring Nordschleife, brilliant circuit. Murray, not Reutemann, he moved to the UK from South Africa in 1969, hoping to work for Lotus, actually, because he was a big admirer, a big fan of Colin Chapman, the legendary, obviously, innovator behind Lotus. But instead, Murray ended up working for Brabhams, after, I think, a chance meeting with then Brabham chief designer and the T of BT, which stood for Brabham Toranak. So I'm talking about Ron Toranak. Then when Bernie Ecclestone took over Brabham, Gordon Murray was made chief designer. And it was from that point on that he designed, among great cars like the BT44 and the BT44B that I've already mentioned. He also designed that, well, crude but effective icon of F1 innovation, the BT46B, also known as the Brabham fan car, as well as the World Championship winning BT49 and BT52. Then, in 1986, he was approached by Ron Dennis to take over the role of McLaren technical director from John Barnard, which he duly did for 1987. And the first McLaren under Murray's watch was the Steve Nicol designed, actually it was Steve Nicol who designed it, not Murray really, the famous MP44. And that won 15 of the 16 races in 1988. And it really should have won them all, shouldn't it?
Can't really be having that, Matt. The race they didn't win, the one race out of the 16, was the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. And that came 3 weeks after the death of Enzo Ferrari at the age of 90. So, you know, I think quite a lot of us have always thought that it was only right and rather poetic, if you like, that one of Ferrari's drivers, Gerhard Berger, should win that day.
OK, I'll give you that. I'll give you that. But it's worth mentioning that the otherwise all-conquering MP44 did actually bear a striking resemblance to the BT55 Brabham low-line concept that Murray had pioneered when he was there at Brabham. In fact, over the period 1988 to 1991, McLaren won 4 consecutive constructors and drivers titles. Ayrton Senna in 1988, Alain Prost in 1989, then Senna again in 1990, and Senna again, yet again, in 1991. I'm saying all this because I think it goes to show that Gordon Murray's reputation in Formula One at the time was that of something of a genius designer. He was regarded, you know, perhaps a little bit like Adrian Newey is today. You know, someone with a reputation for innovation and achieving world championship success, which are two things that don't always actually go hand in hand. Anyway, it was also in this period of complete Formula One domination that the idea for a new McLaren sports car was born, wasn't it, Richard?
Yes, it was in 1988, and it was during a conversation while they were waiting for a flight home from that same Italian Grand Prix, actually, that Murray and Ron Dennis discussed the possibility of building a supercar, a road-going machine that could reach 200 miles an hour, which was obviously a dream of Murray's. But before we go on, Matt, from what you know of Ron, do you think he'd have needed much convincing? And what do you think was his motivation for doing it and doing it at that point? Do you think he just wanted to stick it to Ferrari?
It's a good question. Ron was already extraordinarily ambitious, and I have discussed lots of elements of McLaren's story with him when I finally ended up working with him, and actually before when I was a journalist. I think he disliked the fact that McLaren always seemed to be something of a poor relation to Ferrari. I mean, however easily he sometimes was beating the red cars in Formula One. And yes, he wanted to do a road car. But he wanted to do a road car that would trounce Ferrari's best road cars. And, you know, I think, guess what? I think he succeeded. The McLaren F1 was and is utterly brilliant. We'll talk about it, obviously, during this podcast. A trailblazer, a game changer. It utterly revolutionized how fast a road car could be made to go, both in a straight line and around corners. Oh, and by the way, I've seen Ron's own McLaren F1. I think it's done about 200 miles now.
One careful owner.
Very careful owner. I think it's taken out.
One fantastically careful owner.
Yes. It's taken out, I think, just to exercise it, about once a month. Immaculate beyond immaculate, as you can imagine. And, of course, almost priceless now. I mean, any McLaren F1 is exclusively unobtainable and therefore priceless. But Ron's one with 200 miles on it, serious.
Murray wrote a book called One Formula, 50 Years of Car Design. And in it, he talks about how basically he had the whole idea for the McLaren F1, for that's what it became somewhat confusingly named. He had it all in his head before he started talking to Ron. He explains how he'd got an NSX from Honda, who were McLaren's engine partner at the time. He really liked it. It was a very good car, especially the ride and the handling. But he wanted to fix what he saw as the car's failings, things like a poor driving position that made it hard to see out, crappy aircon, no luggage space, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
He'd originally wanted his car to be a single-seater, but eventually he compromised on a three-seater to retain weight balance. So presumably, if you wanted to take your new girlfriend for a spin, you had to take her mother too.
Or boyfriend, Richard.
Oh, both, if you like. Yeah, why not?
Well, you could take your boyfriend and your girlfriend.
You could, indeed. Why not? Or your mother-in-law and your father-in-law, or any combination, as long as the weight balance was kept.
Exactly.
Anyway, in Gordon Murray's book, he recalled a sketch he'd done in college in the 1960s, where he designed a car with the passengers arranged in an arrowhead formation, with the driver sitting centrally in the car and slightly ahead of the two passengers. And that's what he went for with the F1. And this is what he said about it. Suddenly everything started falling into place in my head. If there was a central driving position, it negated all the horrible things you had in current supercars. It certainly gave you a fantastic control and visibility for driving fast. With the three-seater tucked-in idea, it didn't make it any bigger than a normal car. And most of all, if you were going to buy an expensive, best-in-the-world type car and pay a lot of money for it, then it's my car. The passengers are incidental. They're slightly behind me. If I'm driving quickly down a lane, I'm in control. I'm in the middle, like in an F1 car.
Perfect. Yes. And it might be easy to overlook now how unique that central driving position was at the time, probably because it's since been aped by, many a hypercar constructor. But that F1-like, Formula One-like central driving position was critical to the entire design. I've never actually driven a McLaren F1, but I've been driven in one, very briefly, I must say, but very fast. Amazing. Anyway, Gordon brought in Peter Stevens to work with him on the design of the project, and in what he describes, I believe, as, quote, an infamous 10.5-hour meeting, end quote, he, Gordon Murray, detailed his entire vision for what he hoped would be the ultimate road car. It took 4 years to plan, design and build. Naturally, it would lean heavily on McLaren's Formula One expertise. And by the way, that Formula One authenticity is something that really appealed to Ron. Remember, McLaren was the team that had introduced the carbon fibre monocoque to Formula One in 1981, saving John Watson's life, if you remember, that big shunt, I believe, at the second Lesmo at Monza. Anyway, so it made sense that the McLaren F1 road car would have a lightweight carbon fibre monocoque too, each of which, by the way, took 3,000 hours to make.
This was the no-compromise car.
Absolutely. And we'll hear more, we'll talk, I'm sure. I've got a few notes I've made about more no-compromise in its construction as well, as I'm sure you have. So, to keep weight down, virtually everything on the car was designed in-house and handmade, from the gearbox to the handbrake, from the steering column to the steering rack. You name it, if they could design and build it in-house, they did. And one of Ron's, and by the way, Jackie Stewart's, favourite sayings, attention to detail was everything. The throttle pedal was handcrafted out of 6 separate pieces of titanium. Can you imagine that? And the instrument panels were handmade and hand-painted, each needle individually machined. I mean, why bother? But they did bother. It may have been Gordon's concept and design, but its fit and finish was all wrong. All wrong. Oh, and Gordon even threw in a nod to the Brabham fan car by deploying underbody electric fans to help exploit ground effect and increase the car's downforce. In fact, just about the only significant component they went to an outside supplier for was the engine.
Yeah, it wasn't really a surprise that Gordon Murray was a fan of Honda engines since they'd been so effective in the Grand Prix cars. And he'd been to their research centre in Japan on 2 occasions and asked them to consider building for the McLaren F1 a special 4.5-litre V10 or V12 engine. He wanted a big engine without turbocharging because he thought the inevitable turbo lag would spoil the purity of the experience for the driver. And this is what he said. I asked, Honda, he means, I tried to persuade them, but in the end I couldn't convince them to do it. And the McLaren F1 ended up equipped with a BMW engine. Well, linking up with BMW reunited Murray with Paul Rocher, the legendary BMW engine guru, with whom he'd worked so successfully at Brabham, winning the 1983 Constructors and Drivers titles with a 4-cylinder turbo motor that went like it was running on rocket fuel, which it probably was.
Probably.
Anyway, for this project, Rocher designed and built a mid-mounted 6.1-litre V12 capable of 627 brake horsepower for the road. And that's quite a nice anorak fact for you, Matt.
I definitely think it is. And I have another anorak fact for you related to the engine, Richard. Making a car out of carbon fibre is all well and good. But the carbon fibre body panels and monocoque needed to be thermally insulated from the heat of the engine. So Murray came up with the idea of lining the engine bay with the ultimate efficient heat reflector, gold foil. So there's approximately 16 grams or 0.56 ounces of 24-carat gold used in each McLaren F1. Get that. Imagine that. So that's more than, at today's prices, that's more than £1,000 worth of gold in each car. Today's prices, as I say. But having said that, the car's list price, when it was launched 30-odd years ago, was £634,500. So I guess they could afford a bit of gold. By the way, I will just say it was often quoted at £540,000, but that didn't include 17.5% VAT.
Of course.
So it was $634,000.
That would be enough to put you off, wouldn't it, really?
Well, that's the reason you didn't buy one, wasn't it, Richard?
Of course it was. Anyway, at the risk of turning this into a fact-off, here's another one for you. The McLaren F1 also had the smallest and lightest 10-disc CD player ever made, also sourced from an outside supplier. And that's because Gordon Murray was and is a big music fan. He's known to love Bob Dylan, for one thing, which puts him straight into my good books. And what's interesting about the presence of the CD player is that it underlines that the McLaren F1 was never meant for racing. But it did end up on the track, and we'll get to how that happened after this quick ad break.
Production for the McLaren F1 began in 1992, and the car, which, as I say, could be yours for the princely sum of £634,500, including VAT, was officially launched during the week of the 1993 Monaco Grand Prix, a race, incidentally, won by Ayrton Senna in his McLaren MP48, his 6th and final Monaco win. Anorak fact. In 1994, 2 British car magazines were granted road tests. Car, never the most imaginatively titled magazine, I would say, but Car, for which I was then the features editor, and Autocar. Autocar were allowed to figure it too. Figure it means check its performance, in other words, 0 to 60 and all that kind of thing.
And some people weren't allowed to do that?
We weren't.
Really?
No,
That's
Ron
amazing.
was very specific. Autocar were allowed to figure the car, but we at car were not.
We will let you drive this car for a bit, but we won't let you measure how fast it will go.
Because Autocar wanted the exclusive and had negotiated that. I can't remember why we weren't, other than that. But anyway, we were given something else to compensate us, some other privilege. I can't remember. It's 30 years ago. Anyway, Autocar called it, quote, the finest driving machine yet built for the public road, adding, quote, the F1 will be remembered as one of the great events in the history of the car, and it may possibly be the fastest production road car the world will ever see. End quote.
That is extraordinary, isn't it, to make that statement
I know,
so
and
boldly.
But not far wrong.
One of the great events in the history of the car.
But I think 30 years later, defensible. Anyway, for us, for Car Magazine, Roger Bell, dear Roger Bell, one of Car's regular road testers by then, a lovely man who actually died a couple of years ago and was a fine driver who'd won touring car races in the 1970s. Anyway, he wrote our road test, Car's road test. And here's just one paragraph. It goes like this. It was the car's maximum speed, 231 miles an hour or 372 kilometres per hour, as recorded by McLaren's test driver Jonathan Palmer at Nardo in Italy, that made the headlines. But it's the car's breathtaking acceleration that frightens and thrills. Nothing, but nothing, gets anywhere close to this car, which has the world's best power-to-weight ratio. Even now, I'm not sure which is the more addictive. The slingshot thrust when you slash through the gears, left leg and right arm pumping like pistons, the shift is lightning fast, or the breathtaking sound effects that go with it, terminating in a Formula One style demented yowl. Great prose by Roger Bell. I'll just give a little detail to that as well. He interviewed Gordon Murray in the car, and he took his tape recorder in with him, which was quite a bulky tape recorder at the time. And Gordon Murray said, do you have to bring that in? And he said, well, I just need to record you. And Gordon said, no, the weight of it.
Well, they could put it, if Gordon Murray was in one of the passenger seats, they could have put the tape recorder in the other one to keep it balanced.
But isn't that a typical Gordon Murray story?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I remember Roger saying afterwards, I didn't need it because everything about that car I remembered anyway, including everything Gordon said about it, so I needn't have even recorded him. Anyway, what did you think of the car when you first saw it, Richard? Did it make your heart sing like, and I know you're a Ferrari man, like, I don't know, a Ferrari GTO might?
Well, not exactly, I have to say. I thought it was obviously a very neat-looking car, and I use the word neat on purpose because Gordon Murray's own favourite cars were exquisite 2-litre things from the 60s, like the Porsche 904 and the little Ferrari Dino 206 racer. Remember that?
Beautiful little car.
Yeah, they were designs that were shapely in their lines, but they weren't eye-bogglingly spectacular. They were neat but not gaudy,
exactly.
you would say.
Exactly.
But it was obviously a beautiful thing and an ingenious package, and I would love to have driven one. And it had a sensational engine, even if the 3-seater layout might have seemed a little bit Dandarish.
Dandarish, that takes us back. Yeah, Dandarish or not, I've got a confession. Although I have owned in my life the odd mid-engine car, most recently an Audi R8 actually, and I don't own any now. They aren't really my cup of tea. I always feel a little bit self-conscious in them. You know, by the way, I'm not saying that I drive them often or have owned them often, but I have in my life had the odd one. And when I have had the opportunity to drive, but obviously have never owned, but when I have had the opportunity to drive a red mid-engined Ferrari, even though they're great cars, I know, I always feel a tiny bit self-conscious.
You're supposed to. That's what they're for.
Well,
what's the point of having a red mid-engine Ferrari if it's not going to make you feel self-conscious?
I guess so. Maybe I'm just such a naturally bashful and retiring man, Richard.
Okay. Well,
you don't look convinced.
You're known for that.
You don't. You mean I'm known for that?
Didn't you have a red Corvette once?
I did.
You did, yeah. There you go. You didn't feel remotely self-conscious in that.
This is another podcast. Little Red Corvette, of course, you will tell me all about the Prince song, won't you?
Back to the point.
That's another. That is another podcast as well. Anyway, give me a front-engine GT car, like a Corvette, or indeed, I will say, a rear-engined Porsche 911, which I've owned a few of them. And that's my... Anyway, we're getting off the point. It's not really the point. Besides, the McLaren F1 did indeed receive nearly universal praise in the press. And that was important because it was at a time, Richard, when the company's core product, in other words, its Formula One cars, were far from the best it had ever produced at that point. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, it is, because after those brilliantly successful seasons with Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, McLaren lost their vital engine partner, Honda, at the end of 1992, and they failed in a bid to get the Renault engines that their rivals at Williams were using. So instead, Ron Dennis had to make do with underpowered Fords for 1993 before switching to Peugeot, and that was an arrangement that also lasted only a single season and ended pretty unhappily. In the meantime, they'd also lost Senna, and they were starting a run of 3 seasons without a single Grand Prix win. So I think you'll agree they really needed something to project a sense of confidence and optimism. And out of nowhere...
I do agree, yes.
Yeah, out of nowhere, the racing version of Gordon Murray's F1 road car became an answer. And there are several versions of how that came about. The story that seems most convincing to me is that 2 chaps who'd bought the F1 road cars saw the potential for racing something like them in the new BPR GT Championship, and that was attracting drivers in race-modified Ferrari F40s and Porsche 911 turbos. And those 2 chaps in question were Ray Bellem, a British property developer, and Thomas Buescher, a German banker. Another version is that McLaren themselves came up with the idea in order to help promote the image of the road car, which wasn't actually selling as well as they'd hoped, even at 640 grand.
That's quite true, actually.
Yeah. So anyway, Bellem and Buescher were the first customers for the F1 GTR, as it was called, along with another gentleman driver, Lindsay Owen-Jones, who was the chairman of L'Oreal, the giant cosmetics company. Thomas Buescher actually ordered 2.
Did he indeed? The new F1 GTRs were raced very successfully in the 1995 BPR series, but what the owners really wanted to do was race at Le Mans, didn't they? And luckily, the F1 GTR was Le Mans eligible, thanks to the rules at the time.
Not only was it eligible, it was perfect for the way Le Mans had been changing. And that's a long story, but it has its origins in Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley, and they're usually long stories when those 2 are involved.
Totally.
Trying to take over endurance sports car racing, including Le Mans, of course, at the start of the 90s, working with the connivance of Jean-Marie Balestre, the controversial, shall we say, president of the FIA, the sports governing body. Actually controversial. Irascible is usually the adjective attached to Balestre.
Autocratic, we can go with as well.
Yeah. Their plan was to turn endurance racing into more of a satellite of Formula One, with both types of racing using the same spec of engine to cut costs and attract the big manufacturers, which was what Bernie really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And they wanted to put endurance racing in its place by cutting the traditional 6-hour and 1,000-kilometre events to 350 kilometres, which is barely more than a modern Grand Prix. And they would leave Le Mans as the only true long-distance race, because obviously you can't cut the 24 hours of Le Mans to the 15.5 hours or the 3.5 hours. Not leave it the same anyway. But contested by the same cars as the other races, which wouldn't be much more than sprints. They failed, thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness, honestly.
Yes. There was a near-death experience for Le Mans in 1992 when the 24 Hours attracted only 28 entries, less than half of full field. But the race's owners and organisers, the ACO, mounted some fierce resistance, and eventually they saw off Max and Bernie, and Balestre, who was a Frenchman, of course, and eventually realised that damaging Le Mans would threaten a national treasure. The only good that came from the power struggle as the 90s progressed was the return of Grand Touring cars to Le Mans, which was what it had been for in the first place. Prototypes were still allowed, but the number of serious teams had fallen badly, and there was much more energy going into the GT teams who were entering cars like Corvettes, Jaguar XJ220s, remember those?
I certainly do.
Yep, Porsches, Nissan Skylines, Honda NSXs, and Toyota Supras. And that was a field into which the McLaren F1 GTR fitted perfectly. Of course, it needed modifications, and Gordon Murray came up with a big new rear wing and ceramic carbon brakes, which he'd actually wanted on the road car, but carbon brakes don't really work well until they're heated up, or they didn't in those days, so they weren't much use for tootling in the traffic along Sloane Street.
Yeah.
He also deleted the CD player.
So no Bob Dylan.
No Bob Dylan in those lonely hours before dawn at Le Mans. Nope, not even Bob. And he got rid of the aircon too. And ironically, for entering Le Mans, he had to detune the engine from the road cars. I think you said it was 627 bhp.
I think
Matt?
so, yes.
You did. Down to 600 to meet the strict regulations of the GT1 class. But the racing version of the F1 was a lot lighter, so it was still quicker.
Yeah, it was. So we ended up, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think we ended up with something like 17 different marks on the Le Mans starting grid in 1995. And of the 48 cars on the grid, 7 were McLaren F1 GTRs. But then the whole programme took a twist when a Japanese sponsor, how do you pronounce it? Ueno Clinic?
Ueno, I guess, yeah.
Yeah,
Ueno Clinic.
I've only ever read it. Anyway, yeah. Ueno Clinic entered the frame late in the day and decided it wanted to back a car for the 24 hours. With none of the other teams willing or able to take them on, McLaren really felt it had no other option other than to enter the car for themselves. A move that didn't go down well, not at all well, with the customer teams, who were quite a lot of them furious.
Well, understandably so in the circs. And McLaren nominated a man called Paul Lanzanti to run the car with significant backing from McLaren personnel. He was actually one of Ron Dennis's friends, but although he'd been involved in historic racing, he'd never actually taken on Le Mans. The chassis he was given had actually started life as a development prototype of the original road car, so they took it out of storage and modified it and got it ready for the race. So the squad was very much a wild card. But then again, McLaren as a whole were a wild card at Le Mans.
Very much so.
Yep, they were a completely unknown quantity. And in reality, no one was expecting the F1 GTR to challenge for outright victory over 24 hours in a race that still included a dozen prototypes.
Exactly.
In fact, according to Jeff Hazel, McLaren's competition manager at the time, the F1 GTR owners hadn't initially been expecting much beyond a respectable performance. So after a promising pre-24-hour test at Manicourt in the May of 95, he was surprised to see some of them looking a bit glum. Apparently, they said to him, "We thought we were going to Le Mans just to have a thrash around and be back at the hotel in time for dinner. Now we're going to have to buy some more spares and take more people and take it a lot more seriously."
Victim of their own success. Indeed. Or potential success.
Yeah.
Anyway, the McLaren guys may not have gone there with serious hopes of contending for the overall victory, but they did have some serious drivers in their cars. I mean, let's think. The Harrods-sponsored entry, for example, featured 5-time Le Mans winner Derek Bell and his son Justin, and 1988 Le Mans winner Andy Wallace. And that was one of Thomas Becher's 2 entries. The other one had Jochen Maas and John Nielsen, alongside Becher himself. The wild card, to use your word, Lanzanti team, which was, I mean, really a pseudo-works team, as we've said, they also assembled a serious driver lineup. And it might surprise some people to hear that Ron Dennis, who, let's face it, Ron Dennis, an F1 man, a Formula One man, no Le Mans fan, really, by any stretch, was the architect of that lineup. And I remember reading an article in Motorsport magazine and in which Jeff Hazel said he made it clear to Ron that he wanted the French driver Yannick Dalmas as the car's lead driver. He was already a 2-time Le Mans winner and the perfect lead driver, really. Now, at the time, Ron, always seeing a bigger and perhaps different picture, Ron was fielding Mika Häkkinen in Formula One, and he got, therefore, another flying Finn, J.J. Lehto, also managed by Keke Rosberg. Both Häkkinen and Lehto were managed by Keke Rosberg. Anyway, he got Lehto to fill the second seat in the car. Lehto had a lot of Formula One experience. I think he'd done 62 Formula One Grand Prix at that point, and he'd even scored a podium in Formula One. But although he was quick, undoubtedly quick, he'd never raced at Le Mans before. Nonetheless, the addition of Lehto turned out to be a really shrewd move because he just clicked with the car straight away. He loved its powerful, torquey engine and the way it handled. And as we'll get to later, he ended up, perhaps surprisingly, being one of the stars of the race, didn't he?
He did. I mean, he was one of those guys who appeared in F1 and looked like he might be World Championship material.
For a time, he did, yeah.
Briefly, but then fell away.
He had a lot of talent and pace. Yeah. Anyway, the crew, just for completeness, we should say, the crew was completed by Masanori Sakiya, who was the reigning Japanese touring car champion, who came at the sponsor's behest and was considered a safe pair of hands.
Yes, Sakiya was never one of the better-known Japanese drivers to Western fans. But he felt such an affinity with Le Mans that he'd actually got married there in 1987.
Is that right?
It is indeed. And 1995, in the McLaren, was his 9th go at the race. He'd finished second in 1992 and fourth in 93, both times in Toyotas. So this was a guy who really wanted to win, and he knew his way around. He wasn't just a sponsor's pick.
So maybe I was being a bit unfair, just saying it was the sponsor's behest.
I think there's something to that, but he was, for once, the sponsor got it right.
Yeah, fair enough.
So let's fast forward to the weekend of the race itself, shall we? Overall, it wasn't the most stellar of the lineups for the 24 Hours of Le Mans, but the locals were excited because they knew there was a very good chance of a French win, which always gets them excited. Bob Wallach, the very talented French sports car specialist who'd famously never won the race, was the favourite in the Chevy engine Courage prototype he shared with Mario Andretti and Eric Hillary. But that car was actually beaten to the front row by 2 other French entrants, the WR Peugeots, and they came from a little independent team that arrived at Le Mans every year with the objective of simply going as fast as possible on the Mulsanne Straight, even if the car only lasted a handful of laps.
What a wonderful single objective.
Totally. And, Le Mans used to be the host of teams with that kind of ambition. Brilliant. And much loved they were. And funnily enough, these particular WR Peugeots, they were open cockpit prototypes, and they also had their seat in the middle, like the McLaren coupes.
Fancy that.
The leading McLaren on the grid was the Semi-Works Lanzante car. That was in 9th, behind all 3 Ferrari F40s, which was a bit of a shock for the McLarens. The other McLarens filled the positions 11th to 15th on the grid, with the final one in 20th. And to give you an idea of the pace differential, the Lanzante car was some 11 seconds off the pole time, although in the race the GT cars would gain a good chunk of that back by having significantly better fuel consumption than the prototypes.
But still quite a deficit.
Yeah, certainly a deficit. But then there was the rain.
There was indeed, and the 1995 edition of the Le Mans 24 Hours has been described as the wettest race in the event's history. Would that be right?
I think it was, yeah, and there have been some wet ones.
There have. Rain fell steadily for, I think, around 18 of the 24 hours. I mean, and it's one thing racing at Le Mans in the rain during the day, but it's quite another thing to race at Le Mans in the rain during the night, when visibility becomes absolutely horrendous.
And we'll get to how the race played out after this final break.
There's an old adage at Le Mans, and J.J. Leto said it was one that Yannick Dalmas was keen to emphasise before the start of the race. It goes as follows: you can't win the race in the first hour, or the second hour, or even the 10th hour, but you can definitely lose it. And that's what happened to the prototypes, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah, and that was always one of the keys to Le Mans, that some teams would lose their heads and insist on treating it as a sprint, and they'd find themselves paying the price. That's something that goes all the way back to the beginning of Le Mans.
And still.
I mean, it's why Aston Martin won in 1959, because the Ferraris blew themselves up, pretending it was a Grand Prix. Anyway, so in 95, the very light and aerodynamic WR Peugeots led the first hour, the two cars, with their cast of very obscure French drivers at the wheel, although, not so obscure that they couldn't do close to 400 kilometres an hour on the straight.
Yes.
And they were threatened only by their more famous compatriot, Bob Wallach, in the Courage Chevy.
Listen, we just can't keep mentioning Bob Wallach without calling him Brilliant Bob.
It's in the contract.
It's in the contract. And if anybody's wondering what I'm on about, it was an in-joke among autosport journalists, and it ran for many, many years. Bob Wallach was always referred to in autosport race reports as the Brilliant Bob Wallach.
Even in the captions. He was always the Brilliant Bob.
The Brilliant Bob Wallach. And when I was a kid, I'm talking about in the 70s, when I was a kid, I always wondered why. And when I finally worked at Autosport 20 years later, I had a regular, I don't know if you remember, I had a regular column there for some years.
Who could forget?
Totally impossible to forget. Anyway, I found out why. It was an in-joke. Even today, if you mention Bob Wallach to autosport journalists of a certain vintage, they'll smile and say, Brilliant Bob.
Well, he was. And another wonderful thing about Bob Wallach is that he used to cycle from his home in Strasbourg to Le Mans every year.
Did he?
He'd put on his cycling kit, get on his bike and ride. Kept himself fit. I mean, it's quite a long way from Strasbourg to
That's
Le Mans.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant Bob.
Terrific. Brilliant Bob. Anyway, when the WRs met their inevitable problems and disappeared from the leaderboard, it looked like Wallach, Andretti and Ellery would be taking over. But the rain came, and suddenly it was a lot better to be driving an enclosed GT car with a bit less power to worry about on the slippery surface. And at around 7:45 in the evening, after Andretti had taken over from Wallach, suddenly the leaders had a big problem of their own. Because for all his vast experience and his many championships, the great Mario misjudged the braking of another car at the Porsche curves. It was a slightly slower car, and he thought it was going to brake later than it did, and he spun into the wall, damaging the rear of the Courage. He got back to the pits, but the half an hour it took to replace bits of suspension and bodywork put them down to 28th. So now they were half a dozen laps behind the leading car. And that was one of Thomas Bacher's McLarens, painted in the green and gold colours of the Harrods department store, and shared by Derek and Justin Bell with Andy Wallace. And there were other McLarens in second, third and fifth places by now, and that's despite all of them suffering to some degree with a linkage issue connected to the transverse six-speed gearbox. Even the mechanics on the work-supported Lanzante car were having to bathe the linkage in good old WD-40 every time it came into the pits.
What a great racing detail that is. Anyway, it was during the night that J.J. Leto, had his starring role in the Lanzante run car, wasn't it? I read that at one point Leto was lapping around 30 seconds faster than anyone else, in the dark, in the rain. Le Mans is a long lap, 8.5 miles or 13.6 kilometres, I think, in 1995. But that's still a damn impressive margin over the rest, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've said that this was Leto's first Le Mans, but he got himself into a rhythm during the night, and that's the key at Le Mans, I think. You're coming up behind slower cars all the time, and you just have to think yourself into so they tell me, I haven't done it. You have to think yourself into a rhythm of braking and accelerating and lapping cars constantly, in the dark, in the rain.
With no visibility and big speed differentials.
All the things that have traditionally made Le Mans a terrific challenge. Anyway, he got into this rhythm and he was really happy to carry on. So he did several stints. He could have come in and swapped over with one of the others, but he was happy to stay out there. And it was he who put the car in position to take advantage of their rivals' misfortunes, which is another secret of winning the 24 hours. Actually, for a long time, it looked as though one of Thomas Busch's cars was going to win. Jochen Mass led the race for ages in the team's other car until his clutch failed. And then it seemed that Derek and Justin Bell might become the first father and son to win Le Mans since Louis and Jean-Louis Rosier in 1950.
Nice Anorak fact. Wasn't that the race where Jean-Louis, the father, Jean-Louis was the father, wasn't he?
He was. No, Louis was the father.
Louis
Jean-Louis
was the father.
Was the son.
Jean-Louis was the son.
Yeah.
And didn't Louis do 90% of the miles?
95%.
Yes,
I think.
yes.
Yeah, the
yes.
son got a couple of laps and
Yeah.
that was it.
Yeah.
In the daylight.
Yeah.
But with 2 hours to go on the Harrods car, the Harrods McLaren, a gear shift problem, one of many that they were suffering, cost them time, and it handed the win to the black-painted Lanzante entry. And Leto and Dalmas and Sequia managed to resist a late challenge from Wallach, Andretti and Ellery, who'd managed to take back 5 of the 6 laps they'd lost as the track dried in the morning, but eventually they had to settle for second.
Pretty good, though.
Yeah, pretty good. But interesting that thanks to the horrible conditions, the winners averaged only 105 miles an hour, which made it the slowest Le Mans since 1956, the era of the D-type Jaguars. But no one was too bothered about that.
No, I'm not surprised, yes. And Dalmas became a 3-time Le Mans winner then, and he'd actually win the race again in 1999 with BMW, which... We are doing a few Anorak facts here, which made 4 Le Mans victories with 4 different marks for him. Yeah. Peugeot in 1992, Porsche in 1994, McLaren in 1995, and BMW in 1999.
That is pretty special. That's
it's quite pretty good. A bit Fangio-like in a way.
Yeah, I always like that. I like drivers winning things in different kinds of cars. It shows versatility and all sorts of things.
I agree. And of course, Leto became Finland's first Le Mans winner, and Sequia became Japan's first Le Mans winner. And as we said at the top of the show, McLaren became the first manufacturer since Ferrari in 1949 to win the Le Mans 24 hours at its first attempt. A remarkable feat, given that they had no real idea whether or not the car would last. Ron was never a racing history buff, I can tell you that, because it's true, but he always enjoyed sticking it up Ferrari. So that stat might have pleased him. Better still, McLaren's also filled positions 3, 4 and 5, underlining what a superb car the F1 was in race trim, even running on synthetic fuel made from beet, I believe, as the 5th car was. Anorak fact.
Yep. And the other thing that McLaren achieved with victory was the constructors' equivalent of the driver's triple crown, meaning wins in the Monaco Grand Prix, the Indy 500 and Le Mans. McLaren had won at Indianapolis for the first time in 1972 with a Penske-run car driven by Mark Donoghue. And McLaren won it again with a work-centred car driven by Jonny Rutherford 2 years later. And the McLaren team had won at Monaco for the first of many times in 1984 with Alain Prost. And now they'd captured the 24 hours of Le Mans. The Triple Crown isn't something that's officially recognised, but it's still a pretty special thing, and something McLaren's great rivals, Ferrari, can't claim to have achieved.
Absolutely.
Matt, we know you weren't at McLaren at the time of the Le Mans win, but did you ever get the sense in your years working there that there was a sense of particular pride in having achieved that? Did anyone ever bring it up, and where does it stand among McLaren's achievements?
Well, yes. The Le Mans winning car always sat in pride of place in the McLaren Technology Centre's so-called boulevard, you know, the big, airy foyer, alongside all the mega Formula One cars, Indy cars, Can-Am cars. So, yes, I'd say Le Mans 1995 was and is a matter of pride for all McLarenites. And here's an interesting point. Without the sales revenues generated by selling racing versions of McLaren F1 road car, it would have made a loss.
Really?
Yeah. The fact that the project tipped into the black was the result of the sales of race car derivatives of the road car, Anorak fact.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a sort of variation on the original Enzo Ferrari formula of selling road cars purely to subsidise his racing.
It's almost the other way around.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, what happened next? Gordon Murray went on to produce a long-tail version of the car, which raced successfully, but they couldn't mount a successful defence of their win at Le Mans. A year later, some of the other teams had got their act together, and modifications to the aerodynamics and transmission of the McLaren caused problems in the race. The best McLaren in 1996 couldn't do better than fourth, and they weren't to win the race again.
No, they weren't. So that was the end of that. And, you know, well, I love Ron, really I do, but he did have a habit of falling out with people, or maybe fairer, allowing them to fall out with him. And sadly, that's what happened with him and Gordon Murray. In an interview I read not that long ago, Gordon was asked a question about Ron, and he replied, pass. I mean, it's a shame. It really is, isn't it, Richard?
Yes, it is, but that happens, doesn't it, quite a lot in that world. So there we are, and they achieved something big while they were together. And however the relationship ended, the McLaren F1 certainly left a legacy.
Totally.
It is still the fastest naturally aspirated road car ever built, thanks to a 240-mile-an-hour two-way average run by Andy Wallace, him again, a man I think of as the British Bob Wallach, you know, a really brilliant driver. Because he didn't make it in F1, probably never quite got there.
But we never called him Handy Andy.
He's probably grateful for that, and I think we're not going to start now. Anyway, he achieved that record at the VW test track in 1998, and that surpassed the figure that Jonathan Palmer had set earlier.
Exactly.
That was 240 mile an hour. Still stands. So to many people, the McLaren F1 isn't only the finest sports car of its generation, but also the greatest supercar ever built.
Yeah. How can I put this? I'd say it's a beloved car, if I can use that term. And today it's still highly desirable. Actually, only 106 were ever made in the very limited production run, and that included the race cars, by the way. And I gather that one of the road cars is now in the ownership of Lewis Hamilton. And pleasingly, for a driver who races with number 44 on his car, he owns chassis number 44044, which he bought for $15.6 million in 2017. He's done well, our Lewis. He's done well.
A car that originally cost a mere $640,000, including VAT.
Exactly right. God. Exactly right. But he's done well. He's done well.
Yes. And it's nice to see a bit of romance in his soul, the number 44 and the chassis
Totally.
number 44.
Totally. And I like the fact that he's a petrol head.
Yeah.
Anyway, when Lewis was at McLaren, he had an agreement with Ron that should he deliver 3 Formula One Drivers' World titles for the team, he'd receive the factory's F1 LM prototype, in other words, chassis XP-LM. That never happened, obviously because he left McLaren after one World Championship for us. So that never happened for McLaren at least, although he did win a ton of championships later for someone else, Mercedes. So in the end, he had to buy his own F1. But I remember in the time when I was there, during the 5 years in which I overlapped with him at McLaren, which was 2008 to 2012, whenever he visited the McLaren Technology Centre, whenever he passed that car, orange F1 LM prototype, he used to run over to it, cup his hand against the side window glass and press his head close to the glass under the shade of his cupped hand and peer into its cockpit. I mean, it reminds me, just like I did, and perhaps you did, when I was a kid in the 1960s and 70s, whenever I spotted an E-Type Jag.
Well, yeah, in my case, what would it have been? Something a bit earlier than an E-Type, actually, maybe an XK120.
In the 50s?
Yeah. Why not? What's wrong with the 50s?
Nothing wrong with the 50s.
And speaking of car prices, the owners of the other McLaren cars that had been so unhappy about the Lanzanti entered car in 1995 were reportedly delighted that it won in the end, because a Le Mans win pushed up the value of their own cars very significantly, as it always does.
Perfect.
And of course, the other thing the McLaren F1 did was to inspire the full-scale launch of McLaren Automotive, which today stands among the world's most successful high-end automakers. And in fact, some of the key elements of the F1, like the carbon fibre tub, the butterfly doors, the flat underbody and the air brake, are still signature features on today's McLarens.
Yeah. I mean, today's McLaren road cars are brilliant feats of engineering. They go, stop and steer better than anything, just about. I drove them often when I worked for McLaren. Even though I worked on the Formula One side, I still had a kind of role on the automotive side, and that gave me a good enough excuse to borrow them for weekends from time to time. The first car made by McLaren Automotive was the MP412C. I mean, I must say, we did try hard to persuade Ron not to insist on calling it by a name that would have suited a photocopier better. But he wouldn't be swayed. No, MP412C. Anyway, there we are. Anyway, he did realise, to be fair to Ron, he did realise he was wrong soon after. And the next cars, which called by 3 numbers and a letter, were much more sensibly named. They were better cars too, actually. I loved, during my time with the company, I loved the 570S most. It was a fantastic drive. But as I say, I mean, well, it's irrelevant, but mid-engine cars aren't really my cup of tea, but it was a great car and a great go, stop and steer.
I'll just tell you briefly about how the day those road cars changed my view of McLaren a bit from the outside. I was on my way to the MTC, the McLaren Technology Centre, to some event or other, no doubt that you lured me to.
Possibly.
Because it was in 2011.
Well, I would have been there.
And I was driving, you know, there's a Shell garage on the main road, not far away, just a perfectly ordinary filling station.
Yeah.
And there was a McLaren, whatever the current car was in 2011, MP412C, I think, probably, at one of the pumps with a test driver who was filling it up. And I thought, actually, that's real. That reminds me of how, for decades, Ferraris, when they, you know, every time a new Ferrari came off the line, a test driver would take it out of the factory gates, turn left and drive up the Abitoni road. And that would happen to every Ferrari. And I thought that was real. And so McLaren are doing something proper there. They're turning themselves into a different kind of company, but a really serious one.
It's an interesting observation, actually, that.
Just a little thing, but that's how it made me feel. And now, of course, they make 2,000 of them a year. And those include the iridescent pink 570S that's been parked outside the entrance to the great Gothic and very posh St Pancras Renaissance Hotel in London most days for the past few years. It's actually a tourist attraction of its own now.
Can I tell you something? I passed that this morning. I walked past it, and you know what I noticed? The filler cap was open.
No.
Yes. I thought of Ron.
Somebody's been siphoning off.
No, well, maybe, but I thought of Ron, and I thought of Ron having a fit about the lack of attention to detail.
How would Ron feel about the iridescent pink paint job? That's, you know, you can't imagine him driving it, but I'm slightly amazed that he allowed it to be commissioned.
I mean, there's such a thing as looking after the pennies and pounds, isn't there? If someone wants to buy one in whatever colour, you know, go on ahead.
That's true. Anyway, we should mention too that Gordon Murray, who is the father of the F1, is still applying the same basic philosophy of neat looks and technical perfection, no compromise, to the shatteringly fast and even more shatteringly expensive cars he now makes under his own name. So, a final question, Matt. Where do you think the F1 ranks among McLaren's most significant cars? Is it, in a way, the most important?
Well, among road cars, yes. No question about it.
And that feels like a great place to say, and colossally, that's history. Thanks for joining us today for an F1-flavoured, non-F1 episode, all about a car called the McLaren F1.
Well put. And yes, thanks for joining us, and thanks too to all of you who have left us such kind reviews and comments on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or who've sent us a nice email or tweet. We really do read them all, and we're really delighted that so many of you appear to be enjoying our podcast.
And we are indeed. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can reach us on podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at rwilliams1947 and Matt is at the Bish F1.
And we'll be back again next week with another trip down motor racing memory lane. And remember, if you want to listen to us ad-free or buy some Colossally merchandise, there are links to both the Race Members Club and the Race Shop in the episode description.
So until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And colossally, that's
History.
The Athletic.